How it all started. The Constitution for the United States. A. The Constitution for the United States. A short history of its sources and its application. The Federal Convention and the creation of the U.S. Constitution. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, there were 13 little free countries in place of the 13 colonies. Most of the animosities and jealousies of colonial times still continued. There was a political atmosphere of the Balkan states about this aggregation of small republics. They were flimsily held together by a document known as the Articles of Confederation. It was not a constitution. It did not make a nation. It was a sort of treaty, and was called by the men of the time, a League of Friendship. In the Continental Congress, which consisted of a single legislative chamber, each state had one vote. When a question was put, the delegates from a state would get together and agree on the vote from that state, if they could. If they could not agree, the state did not vote. The affirmative vote of 9 states was required to carry any measure. The Continental Congress had no power to make laws binding individuals. Its action was upon the states as political entities, and not directly upon the citizens. But, even at that, it could not compel a state to do anything. The Congress was, in fact, not a legislative but a diplomatic body. Its members were really ambassadors, and their attitude toward Congress, and toward each other, bore all the historic distrust and caution which ambassadors are supposed to have. Many disputes between the states arose, and on numerous occasions between 1788 and 1789 the air was explosive with threats of interstate wars. New York, for example, considered herself much aggrieved because the farmers of New Jersey brought chickens and vegetables to New York City and sold them there. This took wealth away from New York, so the New Yorkers said, and transferred it to the foreign state of New Jersey. Connecticut people, too, were draining the lifeblood from Manhattan. They brought firewood down to the city and sold it from door to door. Then, with New York's money in their pockets, they would go back to the thrifty state of Connecticut, while New Yorkers worried through the sleepless nights wondering how it would all come out in the end. There was a thorough misunderstanding of the principles of trade, and an inordinate value was set on currency. This narrow provincial sentiment was encouraged by the farmers of New York State. They had produce to sell, and it appeared monstrous to them that the New York State government, which ought to have protected them in their rights, allowed the citizens of other states to get the city trade. They might have got the trade themselves by making their prices lower, but that is exactly what they did not want to do. After a while the New York legislature acted. A tariff law was passed. Every chicken that came from New Jersey, every cabbage from Connecticut, had to go through a custom house and pay duty before being allowed to enter the state of New York. Connecticut and New Jersey applied themselves to ways of retaliation. The Connecticut merchants decided to boycott New York. The New Jersey method was different. On Sandy Hook the state of New York had put up a lighthouse. The New Jersey legislature passed an act for taxing the little scrap of land on which this lighthouse stood, and the tax was made $150 a month. There was another dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania which became so bitter that Connecticut was on the verge of declaring war. Long before the Revolution, settlers from Connecticut had migrated to lands in northern Pennsylvania. Although they made their homes within the borders of that state, they continued to follow the Connecticut laws, and, in fact, considered their communities as a part of the state of Connecticut. After the Revolution, Connecticut claimed this Wyoming Valley, notwithstanding the fact that it did not touch the state of Connecticut at any point. In the quarrel that ensued, men were killed and the dormant Pennsylvania militia bloomed into uniforms and bayonets. Connecticut was about to send an army to protect the people whom she supposed to be her citizens. Finally, the matter came before a special federal court, organized under the Articles of Confederation, and the disputed territory was awarded to Pennsylvania. Under the Confederation, no state could keep a standing army. That was a function of the general government, but the revenue of Congress was so insignificant that it could never afford the luxury of soldiers, and its army was a very small, disarticulated skeleton. Congress could not levy a tax. Its authority in this direction was limited to requisitions on the states, apportioned on the basis of the real estate value of each state. The payment of the requisitions was farcical in the extent of its delinquency. In 1781 it was estimated that the Continental government would require $9 million during the next year. It was thought that $4 million might be borrowed, and the remaining $5 million raised through requisitions. At the end of the year only $422,000 had been paid in the Treasury. Of the requisitions levied in 1788, less than one-fifth had been received in the Continental Treasury by 1785. Each state maintained its own custom house and laid duties on foreign goods according to its own notions. In 1781 Congress, worn to despair on the subject of money, asked permission of the states to collect, for continental expenses, a duty of 5% on all imports. This seemed to be a feasible way out of the money trouble, but it came to nothing. All the states but New York agreed to this 5% impost. New York flatly declined, so nothing could be done. In the meantime 5 years had been consumed in wrangling. There were times when the Continental Treasury did not possess a single dollar of coin, though a huge depreciated volume of Continental paper currency was in circulation. In 1786 New Jersey came out with a statement that she had been badly treated, and she declared that she did not intend to pay any more requisitions or to contribute in any manner to the general scheme of things until New York stopped collecting a tariff on New Jersey goods. Nothing could be done about it. Congress was entirely lacking in executive authority. The President was merely the presiding officer of Congress. He had no more power than the chairman of a mass meeting. To get rid of the army, quietly and without trouble, was the chief unpublic question that disturbed the ruling minds in 1788. It intruded itself sadly, like a ragged and unwelcome guest, in the victory festivals of the period. The soldiers had been treated shamefully, and there was an apprehension in Congress that these patriotic protectors of the nation might kick Congress out of doors and take charge of affairs. Washington managed to disband the army, or most of it, before it was aware of being disbanded. His method was to give furloughs to batches of men, to send them away in groups or singly, and then to send them their discharges later. The idea behind these tactics was to get rid of the soldiers without paying them, though Washington himself wanted them to be paid, as his letters prove. In behalf of Congress it must be said that they had no funds to pay the soldiers. On the other hand, it must be said that they made very little effort to raise money for this purpose. The plain fact is that the commercial element of the country, which had come into authoritative prominence, was tired of the whole crew of patriots. They wanted to disperse the army as soon as possible. The country was full of business schemes and wartime fortunes were growing in arrogance. 80 soldiers mutinied at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in June, 1788. They marched on Philadelphia and appeared in front of the State House where Congress was in session. Congress called on the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, meeting in the same building, for protection, but the council was afraid to bring out the militia, as it was thought that the militia might join the mutineers. The soldiers declared that they wanted their pay and intended to take it from the Treasury. They pointed their guns at the congressional windows but did not fire them. There was a rough playboy air about the whole proceeding. Congress sent an urgent message for help to Washington, who was then at West Point, and without waiting to see what the result would be, the members of Congress unheroically slipped through the back door and made their way through a golden June sunset to Princeton in New Jersey, thus abandoning the seat of government to 80 mutineers and a sergeant. Washington was very efficient in cases of mutiny. He sent 1,500 troops, best fed and best clothed of the army, to Philadelphia at once. That ended the mutiny. Some of the mutineers were whipped, but nobody was shot. The fleeing Congress, wounded in the sphere of dignity, abjured Philadelphia and decided to remain at Princeton. The members were given tea and liquor by the delighted inhabitants, who assured them of protection. Notwithstanding its grotesque adventures, the Continental Congress managed to exist. It held one large asset. The Western Territory, everything from the Appalachians to the Mississippi, had been turned over to Congress by the states. Nearly all the schemes for financing the government, and for liquidating the public debt, revolved around this western land. It was, indeed, an immense domain. It is interesting to reflect that if the government had held it to this day, the entire expense of the national budget could have been met from its rentals. The insignificance of Congress was well known in England. In negotiating the peace treaty, the commissioners of the United States, representing Congress, agreed to recommend to the states that no bar or hindrance be placed against the collection of debts due to British merchants by American citizens. They also agreed to recommend that the seizure of Loyalists' property be discontinued. At first, the British wanted to be paid for the effects of Loyalists taken during the war. Franklin pointed out that sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, and that, in such a case, he would expect the British government to pay for property destroyed by British troops. The argument was dropped by both sides, and the conclusion was that Congress should urge the states not to molest the Loyalists anymore. Such a recommendation was made by Congress, but it had small effect. In some parts of the country, particularly in the South, Loyalist property was seized right and left after the conclusion of peace. As for the collection of debts to British merchants made before the war, it was almost impossible to find either a judge or a jury who would pass favorably on these claims, and their validity drifted into the realm of legal fictions. The British had agreed, on the signing of the treaty, to give up their forts in the Northwest Territory. Years passed, and they still held on to these posts, declaring that they would give them up when the United States had carried out its part of the compact. This attitude seems reasonable, but it did not appeal to the Americans of the 1780s. Just at the end of the war, another blow had been given to New England commercial aspirations by a British order in council which closed the ports of the British West Indies to American ships. Thus, the question which began the war was lost in its successful conclusion. But this closing of West Indian ports was a blessing in disguise. New England ships and sailors had to have some occupation, so in the 1780s we see Massachusetts ships sailing timidly to China with goods which it was thought the Chinese might want. By the year 1800 the Chinese trade was a roaring success, and Yankee merchants were cutting the ground from under the English in that faraway market. In closing the West Indian ports they effectually developed a rival for themselves in the Orient. In the weighty troubles that grew out of the treaty, Congress revealed its weakness at every turn. From the first, many leading men were dissatisfied with the Confederation, and hoped eventually to replace this feeble League of Friendship with a closely knit national government. Washington wrote to Hamilton in 1788, "It is clearly my opinion, unless Congress have powers competent to all general purposes, that the distresses we have encountered, the expense we have incurred, and the blood we have spilt, will avail us nothing." A few weeks later he wrote, "My wish to see the union of these states established upon liberal and permanent principles, and inclination to contribute my mite in pointing out the defects of the present Constitution, are equally great. All my private letters have teemed with these sentiments, and whenever this topic has been the subject of conversation, I have endeavored to disuse and enforce them." There was a body of intelligent opinion in favor of a monarchy. Strange to say, Washington was not considered, so far as we know, by these advocates of monarchy as a possible king, unless Hamilton had him in mind. He was, indeed, written to by an irresponsible colonel who hinted that he ought to be a king, though this man appears to have represented nobody but himself. Washington was a Republican at heart. What he wanted was a republic, but an aristocratic one, where the suffrage and the authority would be in the hands of the well-born and the wealthy. The monarchy movement, if such a vague affair can be called a movement, is obscure. It became so unpopular in the end that its originators, among whom was Nathaniel Gorham and Rufus King, buried it as deeply as they could in their memories. These men felt, evidently, that no plebeian American, however distinguished he might be, was of sufficient prestige to occupy the throne. There is a strong probability that Prince Henry of Prussia, a brother of Frederick the Great, was approached on the subject before the matter was dropped. The spectacle of some gaudy European prince, coming over to occupy a throne in our land of raw liquor and trusty squirrel rifles would have been interesting. This clumsy playing with the idea of a monarchy was hardly more than a sort of moral nostalgia. Certainly any such attempt would have failed miserably, but there was nevertheless a well-grounded effort to create a permanent nobility by an organization of former army officers called the Society of the Cincinnati, in which membership was to be hereditary. Washington was the first president of the society, though he accepted the office, I think, without being aware of the society's intention to influence public affairs. He was displeased with the early conduct of the organization, and resigned from its leadership, but not until he had persuaded the society to drop its hereditary feature. The Society of the Cincinnati exists today as a purely social and praiseworthy organization. The Confederation was a failure, but commerce and finance were riding on the crest of the wave. The close of the war had found the small farmers, as a class, in acute poverty. By taking advantage of the economic needs of these producers, the money-holding groups in the coast cities had been able to get a tight financial grip on almost the whole of the producing class. There were counties in which nearly every acre was under mortgage at high rates of interest. Usury and profit molded themselves into large fortunes. The splendor of business began to shine. The discontent of the common people was snapping at the heels of these primitive money kings. In every legislature there were proposals to repudiate debts, to issue floods of paper money, to impair the value of contracts. In Rhode Island the debtors captured the legislative machinery of the state, and repudiated virtually everything. They made paper money a legal tender and forced merchants and mortgage holders to take it. Capital in that little state became so unsafe that it got out as quickly as it could. The shameful conduct of Rhode Island was a topic at teas and in counting houses from New Hampshire to Georgia. It was the general opinion that something ought to be done about it. The law books were thumbed, and spectacles rested on learned noses. It appeared that nothing could be done under the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island was a free state and could act as she pleased. This was bad enough, but even worse was coming. In 1786 an armed rebellion broke out in western Massachusetts and aroused the execration of all who loved peace and profits. The farmers of that region took up arms against the gaunt destitution of their lives. Their lands could not produce enough to pay the interest on mortgages and provide the food and raiment for human necessity. In addition to the burden of debt, taxes had gone up in Massachusetts until they were $50 per capita. Compared with this, the taxes which Great Britain had attempted to impose on the colonies were nothing more than trifling small change. The rebels were mostly veterans of the Revolution. They put themselves under command of Daniel Shays, who had been an officer in the war. Organized with a sort of military discipline, they constituted in fact a formidable force. Lawyers took to their heels, and the frightened judges were ousted from the courts. Debts were to be abolished. Everybody was to begin over with a clean slate. On this program of extreme simplicity the rebellion throve for a brief moment. The rebels invoked the scriptures and pointed to the ancient Jewish law under which all lands were redistributed every 7 years. Shays, army of desperate debtors, as these men were called, created terrific excitement, not only in New England, but everywhere else. Henry Knox, the Confederation's Secretary of War, was sent to Massachusetts at once. The militia was called out. The money lenders of Boston fluttered in agitation. Washington wrote to Henry Lee, "You talk, my good sir, of employing influence to appease these present tumults in Massachusetts. I know not where that influence is to be found, or, if attainable, that it would be a proper remedy for the disorders. Influence is not government. Let us have a government by which our lives, liberties, and properties will be secured, or let us know the worst at once." Jefferson, on the contrary, does not appear to have been at all upset by the Shays episode and, in this, he stands alone among the notables. He wrote to W. S. Smith, God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. To Mrs. John Adams, of all people, he wrote these disturbing lines. I like a little rebellion now and then. The spirit of resistance to government is so valuable on certain occasions that I wish it to be always kept alive. It will often be exercised when wrong, but better so than not to be exercised at all. The Massachusetts troops eventually drove Shays and his foodless men over the deep snow hills into New Hampshire. In the meantime, Rhode Island sank a notch lower in public estimation by inviting the entire Shays outfit to come to Rhode Island and live. On a wintry day in the New Hampshire hills, Shays' forlorn little army petered out. All the forces of society, represented by a swarm of bayonets, surrounded these rebels as they shivered in the snow. When they were asked by General Lincoln, in command of the Massachusetts troops, what they wanted to do, they said that they wanted to go home. He allowed them to go, and Shays' rebellion came to an end. There was some feeble effort to punish the ringleaders, but nothing came of it. It seems quite clear that the money ring which ruled Massachusetts was afraid to proceed with prosecutions. After this occurrence, the moneyed classes were convinced that affairs were in a sad plight. There was no protection anywhere for capital or investments. A strong, centralized government was urgently needed, the stronger the better. Now, for the first time in American history, we see finance lifting its head above land as an object of attention. It had its origin in the public debt. Let us consider, for a moment, the status of the government's financial obligations in the later 1780s. First, there was the foreign debt, that is, money borrowed abroad by the commissioners of the Continental Congress. This amounted, in 1789, to approximately $10 million, with arrears of interest of nearly $2 million. Second, the domestic continental debt, which ran up to a principal sum of $27 million, to which must be added unpaid interest amounting to $13 million. Thus, the continental obligations, in all, were a little more than $50 million. There is absolutely nothing different now except 210 years have gone by and zeros have been added. The precise total of the combined state debts is unknown, owing to the slipshod character of the records, but it was around $20 million. Say, $70 million for both continental and state debts. This sum of $70 million represents only the funded obligations, represented by certificates or bonds. Besides, there was the enormous volume of continental paper currency, which went down and down until it became entirely worthless and passed out of sight. More than $200 million of it has been issued. Very little of it was ever redeemed, on any terms. The holders of the certificates, or interest-bearing obligations, considered them of small worth. They might be bought readily at prices ranging from 1/6 to 1/20 of their face value. But, suppose a powerful national government could be put in place of the Confederation, a government in complete control of tariffs and indirect taxation. Let us suppose further that it could be done so quietly and so secretly that men with money would be able to buy up this whole mass of depreciated paper before its holders, principally ex-soldiers and very ordinary people, realized the import of the new authority. Then the next step would be a large fiscal operation by which the new and strong government would assume the entire volume of obligations, both state and continental. In a short time these depreciated certificates would rise to par. Golden dream. A dream it was, but, as the virile, go-getting magazines tell us, there are men who make their dreams come true. The men behind the Constitution made theirs come true, to their great profit. The first difficulty was how to begin. The Confederation had to be abolished. If a public campaign were started to do away with the government and put a new one in its place, the substantial citizens of the country would have the whole pack of the debt-ridden and improvident clawing at them, and every little landless theorizer would put forth his plan. Perhaps there were more Shays than one in the country. Some of them might support their fatuous democratic ideas with armies. Besides, a general public knowledge of what they intended to do would vitiate the scheme from the outset. Even the most ignorant holder of certificates would hear of it eventually and keep his government paper, or sell it only at a high price. Into this circle of ideas there came the shrewd notion to call a conference of the states at Annapolis to consider commercial regulations, to devise a uniform system of duties, and so on. After commercial matters had been discussed, then other important matters might be taken up, or the convention might simply drift into a discussion of the general welfare. In this way it might be possible to devise a stronger government and one financially able to assume the debts, under the guise of a commercial conference. The Annapolis Convention, which met in September 1786, did nothing of any consequence. Only 5 states were represented. Alexander Hamilton was there. 5 states and Hamilton, personal secretary to Washington during the Revolution and who became our first Secretary of the Treasury. However, there was a sufficient interchange of views to give the delegates a sense of confidence, so before adjourning they passed a resolution in which they asked Congress to call a convention at Philadelphia, the following May, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, and to report to Congress such an act, as, when agreed to by them, and confirmed by the legislature of every state, would effectually provide for the same. This is how the Federal Convention, which created the Constitution for the United States, came into being. There was something about the Federal Convention that makes one think of a meeting of the board of directors of a large and secretive corporation. 55 sleek, well-to-do gentlemen sitting carelessly in a closed room. Gentlemen who know one another very well. Gentlemen of good manners who apologize for reading their letters in public. Esoteric jokes pass around with snuff boxes of engraved silver. Mild and polite attendants, tiptoeing doorkeepers, and keys that crunch loudly in their locks. In the chair of authority sits the impressive Washington. Gray inside, but majestic outside. Boredom flickers in his eyes. He is grave, serious and bored. But he has the consciousness of doing his duty, the spiritual uplift of meeting expectations. Posterity has its eye on that assembly, and he knows it no matter how others may act. Posterity shall never say, with truth, that George Washington failed in his part. At Washington's side sits little Secretary Jackson, fumbling with his bewildered notes. He left them to posterity, too, but posterity has never been able to make head or tail of them. The delegates pledged themselves to secrecy, like a jury in a murder trial, and for 4 months they met, behind locked doors with hardly a whisper of their proceedings reaching the open air. But some of the delegates took notes for their own use. Among the note-takers was James Madison. It is to him that we owe the most complete report of what occurred. During his lifetime he kept his notes in inviolable secrecy. They were published in 1840. 53 years after the convention. The general impression among the people of the country was that the Federal Convention's powers were limited to a revision of the Articles of Confederation. This impression did not extend to the men in the convention, nor to the well-informed elsewhere. Dr. Charles A. Beard, outspoken and scholarly historian, has given us in his Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, a complete picture of the economic affiliations of each member of the convention. Dr. Beard's book is based on first-hand research. It is ably documented and is streaming with footnotes and citations. One marvels at the patience of its author with fly-blown records. He has shown that at least 5/6 of the members of the convention were holders of public securities or in some other economic sense were directly and personally interested in commercial affairs which would benefit by their labors. His data also prove that most of the members were lawyers by profession and that not one member represented in his immediate personal economic interests the small farming or mechanic classes. Among the members was Robert Morris, friend of Washington, and by far the most important financial figure of the nation. At that time the position of Robert Morris was something like the position of the elder J. P. Morgan 125 years later. He was the acknowledged arbiter of American business. Gouverneur Morris, of the same name but not a relative of